Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 6 of the American Pageant titled The Duel for North America from 1608 to 1763. We're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, content's going to be the same. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. And what I like to do is, after I read the chapter, I match the key terms to each bullet point in the key concepts, and this will really help you organize the information, so I highly recommend you do it. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about the French. We haven't really talked about them in terms of the colonies. We have mentioned the French West Indies, but aside from that, they haven't really been involved, and now they want to be involved. But initially what was stopping them were the Huguenots. These were French Protestants who fought the French Roman Catholics, and it eventually led to a bunch of religious wars in France and really prevented them from exploring and colonizing the New World. And if you go back to chapters 2 and 3, it's really similar to how the British weren't able to explore at first because of the Protestant Reformation. And back to France, they eventually solved this by issuing the Edict of Nantes, which granted limited tolerance to the Huguenots, which means France can explore more. They're basically forcing everybody to sort of get over it so that they can actually do stuff. And again, this is drawing parallels to the British experience first coming into North America, because they also had Queen Elizabeth step up to the crown, and she crushed rebellions in Ireland and internally in Britain to make sure that religious wars weren't going to prevent Britain from exploring. And so the first attempt you should really know about in terms of France going into North America is with Sam Champlain. He colonized Quebec in Canada and created an alliance with the Huron Indians, siding with them in a war against the Iroquois. And the Iroquois eventually became their enemies, preventing them from expanding further into North America. This is a throwback to chapter 1 when we talked about the Iroquois Confederacy. They were a very powerful and robust organization, and they had a lot of power. And Champlain's biggest mistake was not realizing their power, because it really inhibits the French from deeply exploring North America. And although this is unfortunate, the French don't really care about North American colonization. They're really more concerned about maintaining the West Indies. This is a sugar-rich island. We talked about earlier in chapter 5 how Indies provided molasses to the colonies, and Britain tried to stop this with the Molasses Act. This is a very important island, and they really want to maintain control of that. However, they can't help but being attracted to the beaver pelts, which were plentiful and really wanted by the European elite to make all these elaborate French coats and accessories and whatnot. And it eventually leads to these coureurs de bois, boys? I don't know. Which means runners of the wood in French, or voyageurs, who would hunt for beaver, sometimes recruiting Indians. They wanted to recruit the Indians to make it easier to hunt beaver, but ultimately this didn't really work out because the Indians had their own beliefs that sort of contradicted the hunting of animals. And because of all of this, in the fight to gain power in North America, you see several world wars sort of occur. These are really the first semblances of a world war. You have King William's War from 1689 to 1697 and Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713. And really, you don't need to know the details about each of them. Just know some basics. For example, each side had Indian allies. Britain benefited a lot from these wars. They gained Acadia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay. And during the war, they allowed for salutary neglect in the colonies, where there's this growing sense of independence that was increasingly dampened with restrictive British policies following the French and Indian War, which we'll talk about in a bit. Remember, salutary neglect, we saw that after the Glorious Revolution in England. The colonies maintained that. We're seeing that now, and this is giving ample time for the colonies to develop a sense of self-government. So when Britain comes back in and tries to control them, it's going to end very poorly, as we'll see in a bit. You should also note that Britain got some limited trading rights in Spanish America, which eventually leads to a conflict between Robert Jenkin and the Spanish revenue authorities. Robert Jenkin is sent to the Spanish by Britain, and they aren't really pleased with the fact that Britain is allowed to have trading rights in Spain, so they cut off Jenkin's ear and they send him back. Obviously, Britain is very annoyed by that, and it leads to the War of Jenkin's Ear. Again, you don't really need to know the details about it, just know that it happened. But the one war you do need to know about is the French and Indian War. This is going to happen from 17 1754 to 1763. It's also known as the 7 Years' War. And essentially, it started when George Washington goes to the Ohio River Valley to secure the area, and he encounters these French building forts, so he shoots the first shots of the war. And in order to bolster the colonial defense for this war, Britain summoned some colonial delegates for the Albany Congress. And hopefully this would unite the colonies in some way, this shared purpose of keeping safe against France. And these are really the baby steps towards colonial unity, which will obviously become increasingly important. Benjamin Franklin plays a really key role in this Congress as the leader of it. He creates the Join or Die cartoon. The colonies must join together, otherwise they're going to die. They aren't going to survive this conflict. And ultimately, your takeaway from the Albany Congress is, no one really wants to be there. It's kind of just happening because the British are enforcing it. But it is a step. Maybe not a voluntary step, but a step nonetheless. And during the war, really there's not much you should know about. Britain failed miserably under General Braddock, and eventually William Pitt, also known as the Great Commoner because he was well liked among the public, eventually helps the British win the war. And this is a Pyrrhic victory because Britain has a massive amount of debt afterwards. Pyrrhic meaning technically it was a victory, technically the British won, but there were a lot of casualties, a lot of detriments that came with this victory. An example of those detriments is the debt. They had so much money they had to pay back, and this is going to lead to the taxation of the colonies, which is really the beginning of the end for British control over the colonies because they become increasingly strict, and the colonies, for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in later chapters, the colonies don't feel like they're being represented and don't feel like they should be taxed. A big battle you should know about is the Battle of Quebec. This is in 1759. The British general James Wolfe captures Quebec, and so France is no longer having any control over Canada. And by the end of the war, it only really controlled a few islands. So Britain is officially a world power. And after the war, a couple of things happen. For one, you have Pontiac's uprising in 1763. This was led by Indian chief Pontiac, and some tribes and the French tried to push Britain out of the Ohio River Valley. They felt like Britain was becoming too powerful. Britain retaliates using biological warfare. They give them some blankets with smallpox or something like that. And after this entire conflict, Britain realizes that they need to improve their relations with the natives and need to station troops near the frontier. So you're going to see that they're going to try to limit any type of conflict happening in that area. And you see this with the Proclamation of 1763. This banned colonists from settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains in order to prevent conflict with the natives. And the colonists really see this as oppression. They really don't think it's warranted. They don't really understand the motivations behind it and ultimately just defy it. Again, it's not really useful. It doesn't really do much of anything. Okay, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions, and please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us out and lets us know that this video was helpful so that we can make more videos in the future.